Good evening, everybody. My name is Ronald Grimm, and I'm the Program Chair and Vice President of the Washington Map Society. Welcome to all of you to today's joint lecture with the Washington, Rocky Mountain, Chicago, New York, and our latest partner, the Boston Map Society. These societies are nonprofit organizations that support map collecting, cartography, and the study of cartographic history. These groups also supply financial support for this Zoom meeting. If you are not a member, we hope that you will consider joining at least one map society. Please see the chat for links to each of the map society's websites. Members of the Washington Map Society receive 3 annual issues of the Portland Journal, digital access to all past issues of the Portland, digital access to past guest speaker lectures, and many other features in the members-only section of the website. If you're not a member, the Washington Map Society has an introductory rate of $25 for the first year. Now for a few requests for this evening's meeting. Please mute your microphone during the lecture and wait until the question and answer period at the end to ask questions. And please use the chat feature to ask the questions at that time. Please note that this lecture will be recorded, so please turn off your video and microphone if you do not want to be recorded. After the question and answer period, we will leave the meeting open for members to socialize if they wish, at which point you may turn your microphone back on. Our next meeting will be another joint Zoom presentation. It is scheduled for Thursday evening, August 27 at 7 p.m. and it features Elizabeth Bischoff, the Executive Director of the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education, and Professor of History at the University of Southern Maine. And that's in Portland on the eastern coast, not the western coast. She will speak about a 2019 exhibit that she curated, Mapping the Classroom, Teaching Geography and History in 19th and 20th century New England. This should be a particularly appropriate topic for the end of summer 2020, as schools around the country are deciding how to manage the new school year. With the assistance from our partner map societies, we have developed a schedule of Zoom meetings through the end of 2020. These programs are listed on the Washington Map Society website and some of the other websites, and they will also appear in the next issue of the Portland. And now for tonight's program. Our speaker tonight is Garrett Nelson, Curator of Maps and Director of Geographic Education at the Leventhal Map Center at the Boston Public Library. He is trained as an historical geographer whose research focuses on the history of placemaking and planning in New England, with an emphasis on the role of maps in the creation of civic knowledge. He is also a cartographer and programmer with an extensive portfolio of projects that draw from fields like urban studies, historic preservation, and landscape architecture. He holds a BA from Harvard, an MA from the University of Nottingham, with a thesis on Frederick Law Olmsted, and a PhD in geography from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I will now turn the program over to Garrett, who will introduce Bending Lines, Maps, and Data from Distortion to Deception. This is a new initiative of the Leventhal Map and Education Center, which extends the category of persuasive cartography to interrogate a broader question of truth and belief as they are constructed through cartography and data visualization. I hope that you enjoy tonight's presentation. And again, if you have questions, please type them in the chat feature and we will address them at the end of the talk. Garrett?
All right, thanks, Ron. And Ron, you forgot to give my most important title, which of course is, for those of you who don't know, Ron is my predecessor at the Leventhal Map and Education Center. I've been here for almost exactly 1 year today. And to many of my colleagues at the BPL, I am still, quote, the new Ron. The easiest way to introduce myself to most of my colleagues is that I'm the new Ron. And I have very large shoes to fill in that capacity. Thanks to both Ron and John and the Washington Map Society for having me here, such as here can apply to a crowded Zoom room, and also to the other map societies that are co-sponsoring the event, including my own Boston Map Society. A couple of little housekeeping things I mentioned to John and Ron. I actually just moved houses less than 24 hours ago. So I apologize for the extremely poor lighting in this room. I know you won't be able to see my face in beautiful forward lit resolution, but I know you probably didn't tune in for my face. You probably tuned in for the maps that we're gonna look at, fortunately. I also am in a place that is currently getting some severe thunderstorms. So I am hoping that I'm not going to lose power during this, but it's not impossible. And if that does happen, or if the internet cuts out for whatever reason, as we've experienced before in some of our remote broadcasts, I will come back as soon as I can get the connection working again. So please be patient. I'm going to bring this presentation up. Let's see if we can get this to work. All right. Okay. Can everybody see my screen all right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So as Ron noted in his introduction, I'm going to be talking today about an initiative, an exhibition that we put together at the Leventhal Map and Education Center called Bending Lines, Maps and Data from Distortion to Deception. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Leventhal Center, we are an independent organization in a long-term partnership with the Boston Public Library. We oversee, curate, and manage the library's approximately 250,000 cartographic objects. And we ordinarily exhibit in this beautiful space, which you see with a photograph of Ron's final exhibition in the center. This was America Transformed. And Bending Lines was conceived of as a real exhibition. Of course, with all of the things that have happened in our world since February and March, that has not happened, though we are still optimistic it may someday be a real exhibition. But meanwhile, we very quickly transitioned the show to a digital exhibition, which, while it lacks some of the real material qualities of seeing it in person, it of course has the advantage that I can talk to all of you all across the world about it, and you can see and explore it really on your own time. There are many things about the digital exhibition that are superior to a physical exhibition. So everything that I'm going to talk about and share with you today is also online on this digital portal, leventhal-digital-exhibition/bending-lines. Of course, if you just go to leventhalmap.org, it's also prominently featured on our front page of our website. I also want to note too here as well, as I said, I've been at the Map Center for almost exactly 1 year. Exhibitions do not plan themselves in a mere year. So although I'm the curator and I curated this show, it is very much a joint project with my colleagues at the center. Those include Lauren Kennedy, Lauren Chen, Belle Lipton, Michelle LeBlanc, Lynn Brown, Rachel Scherer, and our president, Connie Chin. We also have an excellent team of interns who've been working with us on various projects throughout the year. They were involved in this as well, and particularly two of our interns, Madison Bastris and Corey Sarametis, actually contributed content and research to this exhibition. So what you're seeing really is the work of many hands, and the Map Center is really proud of how it came together in that way. When you visit the exhibition online, or hopefully in 2021, if we're able to show it in person when you come to visit us, you'll see that it's divided into 3 sections. The first of those sections is a section called Why Persuade, it focuses on the motivations for why people in institutions persuade with maps. The second section is called How the Lines Get Bent. It's about cartographic techniques, the construction of visual language, and a critical approach to data. And the final section is called The Power to Make Belief. It examines geographic truth as a social phenomenon and thinks about the ways that cartography is embedded in political and cultural systems. There's also resources for educators on the site. We do a lot of work with K-12 education at the Map Center, as well as higher education. And finally, before I begin, I just want to call out the fact that we've actually been doing a digital video series. I've been hosting guests, some of whom were involved in the preparation of the show, some of whom were authorities on persuasive cartography, like Dr. Judith Tyner. And those are all available on the site and on our YouTube channel. Because those are also available already, and I know that perhaps some of you were able to tune into those as well. In tonight's talk, I'm going to give slightly different cut through bending lines. I'm going to focus on some of the objects that we haven't discussed in these video series already. But of course, there'll be some overlap. But instead of kind of just walking through the exhibition, I'm going to take three kind of conceptual traces through bending lines. In the first part of the talk, I'm going to be talking about persuasion to what ends, moving beyond a conception of persuasive cartography as a kind of static category, a classificatory system for a specific type of map making, and think instead about the logic and the motivations and the power that's involved in creating maps that are meant to persuade. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the deceptions that are embedded into data itself. And I take that term data not just to mean sort of everything that's happened since computers were invented, but a much longer historical arc about data, facts, and knowledge. And then finally, I'm going to conclude with some thoughts about the intimate connection of visual language, truth, and belief. So Bending Lines began its life and is in many ways a show about a category called persuasive cartography. Those of you who are in the map world or either professional or amateur historians of cartography, you've undoubtedly heard the term. It really owes its scholarly sophistication to Professor Judith Tyner, who we were lucky enough to have on as a guest on video earlier this spring. Judith's 1974 dissertation, Persuasive Cartography, an examination of the map as a subjective tool of communication, coined the term and kind of gave coherence to a diverse group of, a diverse set of cartographic objects that, for which their sort of truth status was dubious for different reasons, either because they were deliberate distortions, because they were pieces of advertising material. The concept of subjectivity played a large role in Judith's definition of this term. But there's, of course, there's an even broader literature around truth and lies in map making. Mark Mohamed's influential book, How to Lie with Maps, is perhaps the best known example of cartography as a deliberately deceptive, deliberately provocative activity. The collector P.J. Mode, who we were also fortunate enough to have on an interview, in giving his collection to be digitized at the Cornell University Libraries, also increased the public awareness of persuasive cartography as a collection. And we're very much inspired by PJ's collection, the digital collection at Cornell, and the exhibition that the Cornell Libraries put together around this around last summer. But what I want to argue in Bending Lines is that perhaps the most dangerous fact about, or the most dangerous thing about cartography is not its untruthfulness, but actually its relationship to truth itself. This is a September 2019 column by the New York Times editorialist Charles Blow in the wake of a famous hurricane map created by President Trump to return later. But the headline of this op-ed is really interesting to me in terms maps don't lie unless someone goes out of his way to try to make one do so. It's interesting to me because I can't imagine anybody publishing a column that says words don't lie unless somebody goes out of their way to make one do so. We all know that the truth value of words and of spoken communication is in a deep and complicated relationship with intention, with knowledge, with the relationship between who's speaking and who's listening. And maps are, I'd like to argue, essentially the same thing. But because they have this supposedly factual status, because they seem to many people to be accurate and unproblematic representations of the world, seemingly unmediated by language, this is where the danger creeps in. And in Bending Lines, we really are trying to explode the concept of persuasive cartography to think about how all forms of geographic knowledge and visual communication shape our understanding of the world and operate in complicated ways to make assertions about what we should believe and what we should not believe. We've also tried to engage with this in this show with a kind of emerging scholarly agenda around critical data studies, thinking about data, contemporary cartography, GIS as subject to many of these same questions around who is producing knowledge, who's categorizing knowledge, how is it spread in the world? How does it circulate through institutions and forms of belief? And so in Bending Lines, we take the factual status of maps as something to be explained in every case, which is not to say that all maps lie, that every map should be inherently chucked out as somehow suspect merely because cartographic language is always a kind of process of reducing and simplifying, but to pay a very careful attention to what forms of representation, simplification, assertion, and denial are embedded in the cartographic process itself. So that's why I'm beginning the talk with a section on persuasion to what ends. When we think about a persuasive map, a map that's attempting to convince us of something, what are the ends of that act of persuasion? For in fact, every map tries to persuade, whether that's a kind of seemingly run-of-the-mill GIS map created by let's say a biologist or a biophysical scientist who's trying to persuade you that his or their evidence, their conclusions in a research paper is valid and accurate, or whether it's a commercial marketer who's trying to persuade you to buy something or to invest in something. Paying attention to the motivations and the act of persuasion is something that we highlight throughout the show. Some maps have an obviously persuasive content. They appear to even the most casual observer as an act of marketing. Of course, marketing is most closely connected to commercial marketing, people who actually are trying to convince you to spend your money, to buy something, to invest in something, or to otherwise believe a claim about what is valuable and what is saleable. And this is circa 1890 map of a subdivision just south of Boston in the suburb of Dedham, streetcar suburb of Boston, in the era when streetcar lines were kind of making a new form of suburban development possible. The map itself in some ways is very ordinary. There were hundreds of maps like this published for land speculation countries around the country. They were intimately connected to the projects of financialization of real estate. But a map like this one doesn't really pull any punches about what it wants you to do. It literally uses words to say it. It says, see the amenities, see the terms. It talks about the rates at which you can purchase a home, how you can get credit, how close this suburb is to the city, the types of homes that you might be able to buy, the stability of the investment. We look like a map like this one. To what ends is very clear. The Fairbanks Park Land Company wants you to buy a piece of empty property and to contract with them to build a house on it. And interestingly, this is a development that never actually really got off the ground. A small portion of it was built, but most of it was speculative. And so it really kind of gets to the essence of this commercial enterprise in maps. And of course, there are different forms of commercial enterprise. We compare a few different maps of land speculation in Boston. This one from 1959, a trade magazine, Greater Boston Business Magazine. Advertising, again, a new form of suburbanization. This yellow line is the Route 128 corridor, which in the 1950s was a booming kind of ex-urban development where it was attracting a lot of knowledge workers, corporate industrial parks, famously Panasonic, Polaroid. These red dots indicate locations of industrial parks. But you notice a shift here. Though this is certainly a boosterist map, as published in a business magazine, it's moving towards a seemingly more accurate or referential form of presentation. That, you know, the magazine is merely presenting this as a convenience, as an aid to understand geographically where this belt is. And of course, the assumptions then get buried deeper into the act of communication itself. This corridor the development of this corridor was deeply connected to patterns of racial disinvestment in the central city. Of course, the Greater Boston Business Magazine had kind of financial and class interest in this process as well. And so comparing this map, which is very straightforward about what it's trying to convince you to do, buy a piece of land, in some ways, this map is almost more dangerous, right? It's seemingly innocuous as an indicator map, but it actually has many forms of persuasive ends built into it. And you can see those kind of in an interesting tension in this 1914 map published by the California Development Board. The California Development Board, of course, is a sort of quasi-state agency at a time, you know, when California was still a sort of like golden opportunity for those coming from the East and Midwest. The Development Board was assembled to publish material that could be sent around the country to increase interest in California as an investment site. And I know it's far too small to read probably on your screens. It's a great place to go to our digital exhibition where you can zoom right in, see the texture of the paper. You can get as close in as you like. But this text all around the edge of this map is really interesting in that it's specifically trying to disclaim its persuasive status. It describes itself as the Development Board as a, quote, statewide, non-political, non-sectarian, non-sectional organization. It argues that its materials, quote, bear the stamp of character and are free from the phraseology of exaggeration, and concludes by insisting, we have nothing to sell. So you see here the kind of creation of a form of supposed cartographic accuracy in formation, right? The Development Board is trying to say, all we're doing is giving you the facts. We don't have any interest in this. We want you to have, they talk about, they bring in people who are trained in the discipline of geography. Of course, the teens is very early in the formal consolidation of the discipline of geography in the United States. So engineers and early geographers, they say, you know, we brought in these experts at map making, experts in cartography, and we've given you the facts. But of course, the facts are from a particular intent, persuading to a particular end. And it's this mix of kind of factual and persuasive information that I think makes so many pieces of cartographic communication so interesting. This is a 1920 map from Ireland, published around the time the Home Rule Act, 1920 Home Rule Act was being debated. Of course, a hot period of Irish nationalism, basically protesting against it's protesting against the proposed partition of Ireland into northern and southern halves, and includes in this upper left section a data table about Protestants and Catholics and their composition in the various counties and cities of Northern Ireland, basically trying to prove statistically that Edward Carson, the Irish politician who was involved in drafting this proposal, had kind of, they didn't use the term gerrymandered, but essentially gerrymandered this boundary so that Northern Ireland would have as many Protestants in it, or would be as big as possible, while just maintaining a bare majority of Protestants. And that appeal to kind of factuality, the statistical table, is then coupled with this really bombastic rhetorical language. Talks about the great betrayal, about homogeneous humbug, threefold treachery. And you see here how this appeal to cartographic truth is then being used to launch this obviously nakedly political claim about Irish nationalism. And again, it's these cases where accuracy and truth and representation slip into more complicated terms, where we don't really know exactly Was the intent to deceive? Was the intent to make something more clear? Was the intent to show this at the expense of that? Was something left out deliberately to be hidden, or was something left out simply because every form of cartographic representation has to leave something out if it's not going to be a one-to-one map of the world, the size of the world itself? These are two examples of railroad maps that played fast and loose with scale and projection. On the left is a map of the Boston, Concord, Montreal, and White Mountain Railroads, 1882, published at a time where tourism in the White Mountains of New Hampshire was just becoming an interest of upper middle class tourists from Boston. Boston, Concord, and Montreal had previously been the Boston, Concord, Montreal, and White Mountain Railroad had previously been just the Boston, Concord, and Montreal, when suddenly they realized maybe we actually want to get people riding these rails to go to the mountains, a place which had never been a destination before. And this map, they've stretched Vermont and New Hampshire north to south by a factor of almost 3 in order to emphasize their routes access to this mountainous area. A very similar thing is happening in the map on the upper right. This is a 1927 Canadian National Railway map. If you watch our interview with PJ Mode, this is actually a map from his collection. We talk about it quite a bit in that interview. But it does a very similar thing. The Canadian National shifts the scale halfway through in order to exaggerate its own route through the resort areas of the Canadian Rockies and Jasper National Park, and perhaps more importantly, to push out the route of its competitor, the Canadian Pacific, through Banff National Park. What we've done in the lower right-hand corner is actually to show through a geographic transformation what that map would look like if it was projected back onto reality. Reality, of course, in this case being a Mercator projection, which is used in most web maps. But you can see it, and you can actually, again, explore this online and play with it. But you can see how the right half of the map here is in order to get back into its correct scale, has to get pinched back down so that the Canadian Pacific's railway, which is just southeast of it, it gets pushed off of the map. Paying attention to the ends of persuasion. Why is somebody trying to persuade, and how are they doing so through appeals to different forms of language, different forms of visual presentation? Also helps us think about how the same forms of language or cartographic representation can get used for very different ideological purposes. These are two maps that are visually kind of echo each other in interesting ways. They're both maps of Manhattan, or that focus on Manhattan. They both use red in really dramatic ways. And they both use red in association with international socialism, red, of course, being the color of the socialist movement. But they do it from exactly opposite ideological perspectives. On the left is a map called Concrete Socialism in red. It's an 1895 map by a German emigre socialist named Walter Brueggemann. Became a big agitator for municipal socialism in the United States. And what this map is essentially arguing is that everything that you see in red is already socialist. It's all the parks, it's all the streets, it's all the public buildings, all the public plazas, it's the East River. And the claim is essentially, let's just paint the whole map red. Look at how much of it is red already. Wouldn't it make sense for the whole thing to be red? Municipal socialism is the way of the future. The map on the right is from 1937. Again, the almost exact opposite ideological perspective is published by the name of A. Cloyd Gill, who was the head of a group called the League for Constitutional Government, an extremely right-wing organization coming. This is before the McCarthy movement, but sort of a proto-McCarthyite type movement. Really, its goal was to whip up fear about the presence of socialists and communists in powerful organizations in the United States. And here they've exploded Union Square in Manhattan and colored it red, referred to America's other 60 families. That's a reference to the 1937 Ferdinand Lundberg book, America's 60 Families, which attempted to expose the concentration of wealth and power in 60 families. This map, by contrast, says the other 60 families are these socialist organizations centered around Union Square. Many of them is of Jewish descent or connected to Jewish organizations, so there's kind of a trace of anti-Semitism in this map. For 1937, the connection between the political right and anti-Semitism is as strong as it ever is across the 20th century. But again, these two maps, when we think about the ends of persuasion, what are they trying to do? These are making political claims, right? These are intended to stir up political support for their respective causes. Again, they use similar cartographic techniques to do so, but thinking carefully about how they're embedded in different movements and how they would have been read by different audiences is a really important way of interpreting them. So in this middle section of the talk, I want to think about data itself and how data can lead us into deceptive conclusions about the world and how data is embedded into cartographic language. And I don't just mean data in the sense of the stuff that goes in computers and Excel spreadsheets and that's used in GIS or that's crunched by big organizations like the census, but really thinking about data as all the forms of evidence about the world which we then parse into cartography and map making. We did a really fun project for Bending Lines where we took a set of GIS data about the state of Massachusetts. It looked like this. This is just the kind of how-to guide. We didn't say anything about what we wanted to get from this data. We just described it. There are sets about sort of reference sets like municipal boundaries or school district boundaries. We gave some data about race and demographics and income and teacher salaries and environment. And we gave it to a half dozen cartographers from various walks of life. And we said, give us two different interpretations of this data. Give us two maps that contradict one another, that think about the data from different perspectives, with the goal of saying that the truth about the world is not encoded into the data itself, right? No two people would take this data set and give us the exact same conclusion. But instead, it's the choices that the map maker or the data analysts make about how to model the data, about what to focus on and what to ignore, and how to present it visually that create the truth that we then experience. I'm not going to show all of the sets, though they're all really beautiful. It's hard to pick just a few. It's really, I would encourage you to spend time with them because they're a lot of fun. But this first set was made by a cartographer named Maggie Owens, who works for the Boston Arts and Recreation Department. And Maggie selected a set out of the data that we gave her looking at toxicity, toxic waste release sites across Massachusetts. In this first map, you can see in the title, it says hotbeds of contamination, the toxicity of our cities. Maggie chose to highlight outline in green the most populous cities in the state of Massachusetts, and then do this fairly simple choropleth map where the darker colors refer to more toxic waste sites within a given municipal boundary. And the argument here is pretty clear. Big cities are have more toxic release sites. If you live in a big city, you're more likely to be near toxic contamination. Maggie then took the exact same data set and she did a process called normalization, which is essentially dividing by population. So here, the title has also changed, Rethinking Hazardous Beliefs, Challenging Perceptions of the Dirty City. Here, Maggie's taken the number of toxic release sites and divided it by municipality's population. Western Mass is far less populated, of course, than the metropolitan area of Boston in the east. What we get here is that these very small towns, Chesterfield, Stockbridge, Egremont, actually have far higher per capita numbers of toxic release site than the, quote, dirty cities from the previous map, like Boston. And when we had Maggie on to talk about these maps, she said that she really wanted to create maps that would activate people's biases in challenging ways, right? So there's a link, right, between dirtiness and cities, a link that has to do not only with where industrial activity is, but associations between racial diversity and cleanliness, this mythology of the countryside as being somehow purer than cities, deeply integrated or deeply kind of enmeshed with forms of cultural dominance. And so this map essentially activates that bias. You look and you say, oh, yeah, of course the cities are the dirty place. Of course the cities are where the contamination is. And then this map challenges it. Again, the data itself is the same. The data hasn't changed. We've modeled it in a different way. We've interpreted it in a different way, changed the labeling, changed the text, and we draw a very different conclusion from that. Here's another set of maps where the the choice was not about data modeling, but about cartographic presentation. This set was created by cartographer Lauren Tierney, who's at the Washington Post. And this map is titled Western Massachusetts, Open Space Abounds. Here, Lauren has taken a land use data set that was part of the information we provided, and shown all of the green areas are open space, public use lands. And of course, Western Mass kind of stands out, large parcels of state forest, protected land, much more than the kind of tiny little urban parks in Eastern Massachusetts. The second map, it's called Western Massachusetts Closed to the Public. And she's picked up on a flag in the data about public lands that are either not open to the public, which is shown in brown, kind of brown color here, yellowish brown. And then the dark green is limited access. So for instance, right in the center, you see a large green area. That's the watershed of the Quabbin Reservoir, Boston's drinking supply. So the data is the same. It's information about land use, but the way that what has been selected out of it to present and how that's been connected to a title and interpretation is completely different. So which conclusion do we draw? Is it that Western Massachusetts is full of open space, or that many of the supposed public spaces of Western Massachusetts are actually not so public after all? The answer ultimately is not going to be found in the data, but instead in our interrogation of what do we mean by public, what do we mean by environmental access, and those kinds of questions. And again, this form of playing creatively with cartography to make arguments, we want to emphasize that it's not solely done to deceive or to trick. In our sets of commission maps, we ask the cartographers to create two competing maps, but there are ways in which selectively highlighting or selectively playing with geographic information is actually used to reveal something else. This is an 1862 set of maps produced by the very famous French civil engineer and early essentially pioneer of information visualization, Charles Joseph Menard. It shows the changing flows of cotton from basically into Europe right at the beginning of the American Civil War. And we own these two panels. The Library of Congress has a second set, which go past 1861, deeper into the Civil War. Essentially what these show is that as the American South, as the US South got deeper into the war and get affected by northern blockades, that the flow of cotton diminished, and the United Kingdom in particular substituted it with cotton from their overseas colonies, particularly India. And Menard really distorted geography. So if you zoom in here, England is way, way larger than it really is in relation to Europe. The United States is kind of this funny little hook Florida. None of this is geographically accurate in that sense, but it's been warped to emphasize what Menard wants you to focus on, which are these flow lines. And Menard's inventing a visual language here. We now look at it, we kind of know, okay, must be that the width of those lines is proportional to the flow of cotton. But Menard had to essentially invent that. That visual language didn't exist. And we talk a lot about how the things that we assume we understand are in fact constructed languages. Whether it's a choropleth map, whether it's a star that means this is the capital city, none of those things have innate meaning. Instead, they have to be reproduced and structured into cartographic language, at which point their original construction becomes mystified, right? We forget, okay, why is it that on a line graph we are usually expecting the larger values to be on the top? There's no reason that they need to be. It's just a convention that we tend to follow. And we also think a lot about how data structures themselves encode and embed biases and assumptions about the world. The left chart is from the 1898 Statistical Atlas of the United States, so-called Garrett charts. These were produced based on data from the 1890 census, and they're some of the first visual charts of information that the US Census Bureau produced. And I'm showing this chart not because it's an interesting visualization, though it is, but because it makes a a kind of dramatic visual distinction between, if you follow the center vertical line, on the right of that line is the colored population. It's labeled colored. On the left of it is native stock and then European stock, immigrant stock. And again, something as seemingly innocuous as church is encoding a basic racial division in the categorization of American people. Okay? Encoding that, of course, is reproduced you know, in some of the most poisonous structures of American society. The way that the census counted colored population, the way it counted other types of population. For instance, in Ron's America Transformed show, we look at maps of westward expansion where there are places that have no population. And of course, the caveat is that it's population excluding American Indians, right? So the categorical exclusion of American Indians from statistical data therefore means that the data themselves have reproduced a form of bias and a form of prior categorization of the world. And of course, these kinds of issues are still relevant today as we debate what sorts of racial and ethnic classifications should the census ask about, right? Whenever we look at the world and form kind of a structure of classifications, a structure of knowledge, we reduce the inherent complexity of the world down into categories and checkboxes, we're making arguments about what we think is important and where we think kind of classificatory divides are. We also talk a little bit about how data is always created by people. Computers especially trick us into forgetting that. You know, you pull down a data set from the census and it seems like, oh, it's completely right because, you know, the computer produced this from the census. On the right is just a photograph of census tabulators in 1937 tallying up, in this case, unemployment returns. The first invocation of the term computer, of course, was people. People were computers, oftentimes women, clerical workers. And just because silicon chips have replaced some of this labor, it doesn't mean that people are not still intimately involved with data at every step of the way. And so pushing back at all sorts of data structures. We talk about coronavirus maps, who counted the cases, who was tabulating different states, public health bureaus, how are those being reported, how are they being categorized, how are their data authenticity managed. And then finally, the way that these kinds of data structures, information about the world, then become almost more real than the reality itself. This is a 1911 map, boundary dispute between the United States and Mexico that almost led to the assassination of both the US and Mexican presidents. Boundary disputes, of course, are famous examples of the way cartographic knowledge becomes a political issue. But in fact, the very creation of geographic truth and accuracy is revealed here to have a political component. These two maps are what you get when you look at Jammu and Kashmir depending on your perspective, either northwestern India or northeastern Pakistan or southwestern China. On the left is what it looks like if you're, on the left is if you're looking at Google Maps from India. If they think your IP address is in India, they show a solid line around Jammu and Kashmir showing it inside of India, truly permanently inside of India. If you're most other place in the world, it shows this mishmash of dotted lines saying that basically this is contested territory. It's not clear who has sovereignty on which sides of which borders. This is in part a reaction to the fact that in 2016, India almost passed a law that would have imposed a $15 million US dollar fine or up to 7 years of jail time for having, quote, inaccurate geographic information. And what they meant by inaccurate, of course, were boundaries that did not show that Jammu and Kashmir were integrally part of the Indian territory. So what is the kind of true answer? Like, what is an accurate presentation of the boundary line of India? Well, it depends very much on who you are and what institutions are kind of in a position of power and control over you. So I'm going to wrap it up finally with this kind of like key insight from Bending Lines, which is to say, how do we construct what we think we know about the world and what we don't know about the world through maps, cartography, and visual language? This is a zoom-in inset from a 1626 John Speed map of the world, showing a very famous kind of error in European cartography, the presentation of California as an island, something which most Europeans probably knew was perhaps wrong. The Spanish Empire may have played a role in deliberately sowing confusion about whether California was an island or not. But in this whole section, I'm kind of pushing back. It's not to say, oh, look how wrong, inaccurate this map, but rather to say, how do we know, in fact, that California is not an island? Right? I have never walked around California to determine that, in fact, it is not an island. I've never been far enough in space to look at all of California to see it's not an island. I only know California is not an island because on thousands and thousands of maps produced by people that I trust, California is not an island. And if thousands and thousands of maps produced by people I trust showed California as an island, I probably would believe that California is an island too. So because the world always is in excess of our ability to verify its verify facts about it ourselves, nobody can walk around and inspect every single geographic truth about the world, we rely on a kind of informed assumption of consent that this must be true because I've seen it enough places and I can't think of a reason why somebody would have been trying to trick me otherwise. The title of this map is a, quote, new and accurate map of the world. And I like thinking about the etymology of that word accurate. We now think of accuracy as meaning a kind of perfect correspondence with the world itself, right? So if something's accurate, it means if I compared it to like something that wasn't produced by humans at all, they would match up exactly. But the word accuracy actually comes from the term care, which is of course, also to be a curator has the same etymological root. I think it's actually more interesting to think of accuracy as having been executed with care. So some maps are not executed with care, either because the map maker was sloppy and didn't pause to think of potential objections to their presentation, or because they were deliberately trying to obscure things or to promote others. So, this, for instance, this land speculation map that I began with, they were not proceeding with a care of informing you about, dispassionately about Fairbanks Park. They had an agenda there. But we can think about care as a cartographer's obligation to their readers and to their viewers, and thinking about this social relationship as actually what produces accuracy. This is a map, it's an 1892 map by a guy named Gleason, who was a kind of bit of a religious kook. In 1890, he published a book called Is the Bible from Heaven? Is the Earth a Globe? And we show this map because in our present day, it has been sort of seized upon by flat earthers, people who think that the Earth is not in fact a globe. Gleason also did not think that the Earth was a globe, and produced this map correspondingly. What's interesting about this is it is one of the most accessed items in our digital collections, and in fact in the entire Boston Public Library's digital repository. And why is that? It's because our institutional imprimatur, the fact that this object exists in an august institution like the Boston Public Library, gives people who already suspect that something's going on, it gives them the kind of the frisson of, oh my gosh, if the Boston Public Library has this in their digital collections, doesn't it prove that the Earth really is flat? Again, that leads us to think about what is our role as curators of information, as institutions that have authority, right? The Boston Public Library has an enormous amount of authority as a supposed caretaker of truth and accuracy. And this is an interesting case where that authority has been bent in interesting ways. This is the 1968 Earthrise photo from the Apollo 8 mission. And again, this relationship between seeing something and believing it. By 1968, most people knew that the Earth was floating in space. It was, an object of common scientific knowledge. But this photograph had an enormously powerful effect on the collective psyche of humanity. In some ways launched the environmental movement. Really to see this blue marble hanging out there in space, something about the power of the photograph. It's like perceived accuracy about the world, changed a form of belief in which like a kind of raw knowledge before had not had the same kind of emotional purchase. So I mentioned Trump's famous hurricane map where he adjusted in Sharpie the route of Hurricane Dorian in September 2019 to make it correspond with his own earlier tweets. And of course, it's kind of risible in some ways, an obvious abuse of public authority. But rather than kind of just ripping on Trump for this kind of ridiculous act of cartographic line bending, one of the things that I'm always at pains to emphasize is that constructing the truth through maps is not always or even ever an act of coercion and domination and lying and deception. But in fact, maps and cartography and knowledge have been bent to make many different kinds of statements. This is the 1982 Nuclear War Atlas, published by the radical cartography Bill Bunge, who has the exact opposite politics as Trump, but it makes some very interesting, fast and loose and kind of creative choices about cartographic presentation to argue against nuclear proliferation at a time when the Cold War was still being fought very hotly. But also, when we look at something like this, which is the Southern Poverty Law Center's crowdsourced map of Confederate place names in the United States, right? Of course, this map is trying to make an argument. It's persuasive. It's not really a reference map. It was published as part of an argument that the SPLC was making to remove these objects from the public landscape. And in kind of selecting and dramatically presenting these sites that have Confederate names on them, one sees, in fact, these places are all over they certainly saturate the South. They're all over the United States. And this timeline is an interesting choice of visual language too. It shows that many of these are not actually very historic at all. They were put up during the Jim Crow era, or there's another burst during the Civil War era. They're actually objects of political the Confederate monuments are objects of political reaction rather than this kind of nostalgia for the Old South. This is a really interesting map in the way it uses crowdsourced data that made this data open. We actually took this map, and if you look on our website, we made an animation of it over time so you can see these explosions of Confederate names that go up during Jim Crow and the Civil Rights era. So again, how are different forms of argumentation about the world being constructed through cartography? These maps were published only a year from each other. On the left is an 1899 map created by the well-known Scottish cartographer John Bartholomew as a plate in a book by a kind of awful British colonialist Henry Hamilton Johnston. The title of this map is called The Colonizability of Africa. The different colors refer to the suitability of parts of Africa for European colonization. A really kind of disgusting interpretation of Africa as being valuable merely as the site of white expansion, white resource exploitation. It's interesting because Bartholomew, of course, is a well-known figure in scientific cartography at the turn of the century. And this map is a reminder to those who would say, well, all I'm doing in my cartography is producing reference material, producing facts that can then be interpreted. Bartholomew here is being, his work as a cartographer is being employed in a project of white supremacy. The map on the right is just a year later, 1900, produced by W.B. Du Bois for the Paris exhibition, Centennial exhibition. And it shows a very, very different interpretation of Africa. One that's perhaps, you can say that there's less detail on this map, right? It's not showing climactic zones the way that Bartholomew is, but it's making a much more liberatory argument about Pan-Africanism, showing the relationship of African peoples to their sites of enslavement in the Western Hemisphere, then forming the grounds of Du Bois's belief that this sort of Pan-African movement was needed to think about the problems of the color line in the United States. So I'm going to conclude by showing this final map that we also commissioned actually for the education section of our show. We commissioned a pair of Boston-based illustrators, Raoul III and Elaine Bay, to make this map for us. It's based on a choropleth map of the densest census tracts of children, the census tracts with the most children under the age of 18 in Boston. If I wanted to know statistically and factually where do children live in Boston, maybe a kind of dry, scientific-looking map might be the thing that I want. But this map is much more interesting in that this is both legible to a child, it's memorable, it's interesting. We see this kind of like figure down the middle through the neighborhoods of Boston that have the most children. We can kind of think about where the demographic balance of different neighborhoods of Boston lie relative to their representation in Boston politics and relative to concentrations of wealth and affluence in Boston. And so again, seeing is believing, right? Would you trust this more, or would you trust some sort of like GIS generated cartography? The answer is like always contextual, right? How we come to understand the world through these cartographic presentations and contextual, and who's making the map, why they're doing it, and in what ways we're paying attention to it. So I think I've already gone a little long. I'm going to end it here. I encourage you to visit the digital exhibition online and spend some time with it. We also have been putting out quite a bit of content from it on our Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter accounts. That's at BPL Maps. And finally, if you have a chance, we'd love your feedback. You'll see the link if you click through the exhibition a few times, or if you go to bit.ly/BL-participant. There's a short survey. We're curious to know how people are interacting with it, because obviously we're not seeing you physically in our gallery. And so we want to know a little bit about what works and what doesn't. I'll leave it there. I think we're going to do questions via the chat box. Is that right, Ron?
Okay, Garrett, I will try to get us started on this.
Okay.
There were initially 2 questions about how the slides would be shared. And I just want to reiterate that the presentation tonight has been taped and will be available on the Washington Map Society website for members. But the exhibit itself has been totally digitized and is online at the Leventhal Map Center website. Yep. So you have 2 ways to look at the images from tonight's presentation.
And Ron, I'm happy. I'll make a PDF of these slides, even though most of them are just images that you can find in better quality on the exhibition itself. But I can make just a version of these slides that's shareable if people want that as well.
Okay. Okay, one of the question that was asked near the very beginning, and I think you've probably touched on this, but it might be good to reiterate the answer. Emily Garfield asked, what kind of cartography isn't persuasive? Aren't all maps made to highlight some information and downplay others?
I love the question, Emily, because in some ways it's really what we're getting at in the exhibition, is to think about persuasion as a rhetorical move that's made in essentially all forms of cartography. And actually, if you want more on this, I'd encourage you to watch our interview with Judith Tyner. It was really interesting because we talked a little bit with her about, she coined this term persuasive cartography, but over the course of her career, she came around more to this same conclusion that persuasion really is embedded in all forms of geographic communication, and so really our challenge is if we take it that all cartography is making representational choices, all cartography is making persuasive choices, then how do we sift out the deceptive lies from the empowering revealings of truth? How do we think about map making not in terms of this map is true and this map is false, this map is accurate and this map is inaccurate, but thinking about the social systems that give an object accuracy or power or legibility in a certain context.
Okay, here's a question from Sam Tenenbaum. What was the persuasive purpose of the famous Reynolds political map of the United States?
I don't know it well enough to say. I'll have to spend some more time on that. Although, of course, this is a great. I don't know how many 100 or so people that we have in the chat. If anybody else has a stab at that, but I don't know it well enough to speak with authority on it.
Okay. Next question from Nick Pansick. Any insight into why the flat Earth projection map became the basis of the United Nations logo?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll actually link to, I just noticed somebody asked a question about the errors of projection systems. So I'm going to kind of answer both of those questions in one go. We do talk a lot about projections and of course how any representation of a round, or it's not even really round, a geoidal Earth onto a flat piece of paper or a flat computer screen is going to involve distortion. And we have some fun interactives that you can play with and actually transform the Earth into many, many different projections and see how that affects. There's a famous example of somebody's face. If the globe was a person's head, what would that look like in different projections? So play with that a little bit online. One of those projections is the Azimuthal projection, which it's a polar Azimuthal projection, shows the globe projected outward from one of the poles. We show Richard Eads Harrison's polar Azimuthal projection of the Second World War. And Harrison argued that the projection was really necessary to understand the geographic scope of a world war where airplanes, radios were connecting territories in dramatic new ways. The old rectangular Mercator projection couldn't show that, you know, if you flew over the pole, Canada and Russia, for instance, were quite close to one another. And so that polar projection really became a symbol of world war. And in its immediate aftermath, as the world was kind of reeling from this dramatically new form of global interconnectedness, world peace. So the United Nations chose that Azimuthal projection as its flag. And we talk about exactly this in our section on projections. So make sure to take a look at it. I should say, by way of somewhat self-promotion, we later this fall are going to be hosting a digital lecture together with our partners at the Boston Public Library with Daniel Immerwahr, whose new book, How to Hide an Empire, touches, amongst other subjects, on the sort of the prominence of the Azimuthal projection and, in fact, Harrison's cartography in this post-world global order.
Okay, Jack Vaughn asks, the news or the history of today is much about the pandemic. Maps tell us what is going on there. Are there indications at this point of the line bending maps in relation to this?
Yeah, absolutely. We've been talking a lot with both in our education programs and in public interpretation about how does one interpret a coronavirus maps? And there's so many layers there. I mentioned briefly a kind of critical approach to the data itself, right? So when we see, you know, let's say an interactive map online, like in the New York Times or on your state public board of health, there's an assumption that, okay, well, the data behind it must, you know, inherently be correct. But wait a minute, how is that data being collated, right? What counts as a coronavirus case? What doesn't? How's it reported? Who's reporting it? Who's tabulating it? Is it being divided by counties or towns or some other method? So the data itself requires interrogation. And then the forms of cartographic presentation, of course, require that in an even deeper way. I showed you Maggie's map of toxic waste sites, one of which was normalized and the other wasn't. Of course, coronavirus should we normalize case counts so that we're looking at them, say, per 1,000 of population? Should we show them at what levels of geography? Is a choropleth map or is a proportional symbol map the correct way of showing it? I think we're actually going to do something soon. There was a little fracas in Georgia, the state's case count map. As they updated it, they changed the choropleth classification system so that the colors stayed the same even as the case counts got higher and higher. So the kind of like blood red color for, you know, the worst counties. They had classified it probably by deciles, I think. So that there were always a decile's worth of counties in that red color, even as the absolute number continued to climb. And the question is, was that done to deliberately de-emphasize this escalating public health crisis in Georgia? You know, were politicians involved saying we need to cover this up? Was it just an artifact of like a GIS system? Like somebody was just using the default settings and they had never thought to fix them. That's why I really like introducing this question of care, because it in some ways covers both of those circumstances, right? It could have been that you know, a state was really trying to muck with the data and to hide things, which obviously is not executing a map with care. But also if one is just like lazily taking the classification system spit out by ArcGIS, that's also not taking care with communication and with the presentation of information. So it's a different sort of form of malfeasance.
If I could just add a plug for a future meeting here on this topic of the pandemic and COVID-19, John Hessler from the Library of Congress will be speaking to us the first week in September about his efforts to map COVID-19. And as a point to one of our past speakers, Andy Rhodes, who spoke to us about FDR's map, has also constructed some maps showing the incidence and spread of COVID-19. So there, yes, this is going to become a very timely cartographic subject at this point. Probably one more question here. I haven't scanned all of them, but from Tim Weiskell, does your exhibit discuss the era of projection systems, i.e. those built into Mercator projections? Why all world maps are wrong?
Yeah, I tried to say a little bit about that in my answer to the Azimuthal projection question. And yes, we do talk, we have a whole section on projections. I mentioned we have these little interactives that are fun to play with, looking at a bunch of different projection systems. There's also a fun little embedded video from a Canadian animator whose name I'm going to forget because it's not in front of me, but showing projecting a grapefruit peel. So yes, we do talk about that.
Okay, some, I guess, more technical ones. Somebody wanted to know how they can access the interview with Judith Tyner, and another one wants to know how to access the map showing the locations of the Confederate names.
Yeah, so everything, and I can type the URL one more time, everything associated with the exhibition is on our website, which I'm going to type into the chat right now so that you can click on it. You can also, of course, get to it from leventhalmap.org directly. The exhibition events section has all of the interviews, including the one with Judith Tyner, and it has the Southern Poverty Law Center's map in the exhibition format, as well as a link out to the SPLC's original report.
Okay. Well, I think we better bring this to a close, and I would like to thank you, Garrett. And as we normally do with Washington Map Society meetings, I'd like to hand you some gifts for the speaking, but I'm just going to have to put them in the mail, and hopefully you'll be in the office one of these days to pick them up. But first of all, now this is a real distortion of Boston. It's really sort of an artistic map with various colors. It's created by a company here in DC called Cherry Blossom Creations. And then this one is a cut line steel map of Boston.
Oh, cool.
And so there you really have bending your lines in this particular one.
Cool, very cool. Great, well, John and Ron and all the other members of WMS, and it's been so nice. And of course, everybody else who tuned in from other map societies or wherever else. I'm so pleased to be able to talk with you from the sweltering heat of my own home.
Okay, and again, I want to thank all of you for attending this and participating in this this experiment with the various map societies. From what I can see, we probably had about 200 participants tonight. According to the initial registration, somebody registered from Hawaii, several people from California, one from the United Kingdom, one from Lisbon, and one from Argentina. I don't know if those folks are here, but obviously this topic gendered a lot of interest, and I'm just pleased for the participation that we're getting with these particular lectures. So if you want to unmute yourself and say something, please do.